Hi everyone. In this discussion, we will have an introduction to different ways of knowing. In other words, epistemology. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge, and how these different ways of knowing, these theories of knowledge, impact curriculum and instruction. I'll focus on two very distinct theories of knowledge that have a tendency to clash within the field of curriculum and instruction. First of all, you need to know what the field of epistemology means. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge. It's one of the branches of philosophy. We deal with what's the nature of knowledge, what are the origins of knowledge, how do we gain knowledge, and what are the limitations of knowledge, what are the limitations of what we can't know. Now again, this is meant to be just a brief introduction. I'm not going in depth in this discussion. We deal with rationalism as one of the branches of epistemology. Rationalism, for those of you that study social constructivism, John Dewey, Lev Vygotsky, rationalism very much influences the constructivist field of thought, Piaget, for instance. Rationalism regards reason as the chief source of knowledge. We construct knowledge from in our mind. You remember Descartes, I think, therefore I am, drawing on Socrates and Plato is where we get the branch of rationalism from. In its most radical form, very radical, some rationalists reject all forms of knowledge derived from sensory experience in favor of pure reason. However, most rationalists out there in the field of philosophy today do attach meaning making to sensory experience as well as reason. René Descartes is one of the progenitors of rationalism. He regarded intuition as key to understanding knowledge. Intuition is knowledge given to us by reasoning. Now, René Descartes was very much religious, so he was very much influenced by Christianity in his philosophy. The development of knowledge consists in the logical deduction of truths through reason. He applied a mathematical method to philosophy. He regards some ideas as those imposed on the mind from without. These are not clear. Adventitious ideas, that's what these are. Factitious ideas are created by the mind by imagination. These are not clear either, so you can't trust either one of these two. But he did believe in what are called innate ideas. These are implanted in the mind by God. If you can reason your way to these innate ideas that are implanted in the mind by God, then you have clear reason. So again, this is very much influenced by his religious Christian belief system. You also had at the extreme end of rationalism, LEIBNIZ is an example of a rationalist. He held that the world has logical and mathematical order to it, and that you can deduct what is reality from mathematics, from logic. The laws in the natural world that govern this world are orderly. They are rational. Therefore, they can be comprehended through reason. The rational laws governing the world are to be found through reason. That's LEIBNIZ. Like I said earlier, when you hear about constructivism, social constructivism, Vygotsky, for instance, John Dewey, this is very much influenced by the rationalist school of thought in epistemology. People are thought of as actively making their own knowledge. Reality is determined by the experiences of the learner in constructivism. Knowledge is constructed actively by each student, drawing on what they read, drawing on background knowledge, drawing on their own experience, drawing on their activities in the social context, and drawing on their influences by the cultures in which students interact. Then, at the opposite end, we get into empiricism. With empiricism, experience is the source of knowledge. Empiricism is, like I said, the very much opposite of rationalism. Empiricism holds that knowledge is derived from sense experience. Notice the very much the opposite of rationalism here. John Locke is an example of an empiricist. At the time of birth, the mind is tabula rasa, a blank slate. Notice that's very different from what Descartes was saying. Experience consists of both sensation as well as reflection. Sensation is the source of our knowledge of the sensory qualities of objects, your sight, taste, touch, etc. Then we reflect on it. And reflection is the source of our internal state of mind, our perceptions, our beliefs, our internal thoughts. Now, both of these things matter. You do experience the world through the sensations, and the ultimate source is the sensation, but you make sense out of this through reason, according to Locke. And at the extreme end of empiricists, you get David Hume. Hume was an empiricist. Now, Locke was religious, David Hume was not. For David Hume, he denies the existence of anything that can't be verified through sensory experience. And yes, this does include the religious beliefs. He denies that. So again, Locke was not. Locke was Christian. Locke was not atheist. David Hume was atheist. And as we look through the branches of philosophy, that's important to note because it does impact people in terms of their belief systems on this way. Now, when we talk about positivism, and in some of your books, you'll see positivism talked about. Positivism very much draws on empiricism. So again, this tells you that positivism stands at the opposite end of constructivism. Positivism and constructivism tend to be at odds with each other. Positivism is connected when you hear talk of paradigmatic or declaratory knowledge and transmission approaches. This is very much connected to positivism. Auguste Comte is a philosopher very much connected with the origins of positivist trains of thought. For Comte and the positivist school of thought, the only appropriate objects and criteria for human knowledge are data and sense experience. So a positivist would seek to describe evidence in terms of sensory experience, and they would seek data that can be verified in the real world through sense experience. Now, these days, because positivism tends to be very strict in its approach, you also will have what's called post-positivism, which is grounded in sense experience and data, but also makes room for reason as well. For instance, in terms of that, you get Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant sought to synthesize empiricism and rationalism. I would not call Kant a pure empiricist or a pure rationalist. And many philosophers, many approaches these days are a little bit of a synthesis of the two. For Kant, the mind receives sensation from without, the external world. These sensations are produced by what he called noumena, or things in and of themselves. These are the materials of knowledge. So we get our knowledge from the outside world, in other words. These sensations in and of themselves don't give us knowledge unless it is through reasoning. So we construct our knowledge too. See how he's combining the two? So for Kant, a famous quote of his, conception without perception is empty. Perception without conception is blind. So then we get into implications for teaching. I want you to make note that different theorists may lean closer to either empiricism, rationalism, or a synthesis of the two. When you look at some of the names out there, for instance, when you think of behaviorists like Skinner, they tend to lean closer to empiricists. When you think of constructivists like Vygotsky, like Dewey. Some of in one of my classes, I've got you studying the work of Peter Smagorinsky, for instance. That would lean very much in the rationalist school of thought. And you do have this clash between the two. It very much influences. For instance, for the constructivists, you look for how does the mind work? What's the process? For the empiricists, you look for, okay, what's the bottom line data? So it is important to tell the difference between the two, where these people are coming from, because no single epistemological view holds a monopoly in education. And it's also important to know the biases of the writers that you study, even your professors. I tend to lean in the direction myself of being a rationalist and a social constructivist, just to give you my bias in terms of my approach. That being said, I want you as a teacher to know these two as well as to be able to synthesize, because honestly speaking, it's absolutely okay, even though I lean in the direction of social constructivism, it's absolutely okay for you to lean in the direction of positivism and empiricism. Absolutely okay. I just want you to be an excellent teacher. But it is important for you to know where these people are coming from that you're reading, so that you can know their biases, you can know their backgrounds, because it very much informs their approaches to teaching as well as their importance to understanding research. So, for instance, we've talked in one of my classes about the transmission approach to teaching and to learning. In the transmission approach, think of something that is transmitted. Knowledge is thought of as stable and objective. Notice that's sensory, that's empiricist. It tends to be very much teacher-centered. The teacher is the center. The teacher is transmitting to the more passive student. For instance, you hear of final draft speech versus exploratory talk. Final draft speech tends to be very much associated with empiricism. It has a certainty, a clarity to it. It is very much authoritative. The product is thought to be complete. And as is noted by Smagorinsky, in many classrooms, the final draft speech is what is predominantly rewarded. You also have exploratory talk. That's where you think aloud while working through ideas. That's more associated with social constructivism and with constructivism and with rationalism in terms of its origins, its train of thought. When you think of think aloud strategies in terms of scaffolding instruction, for instance, which comes from Vygotsky. Again, you can see where this is constructivist, this is very much rationalist. Paradigmatic knowledge. It's rational, problem solving. It emphasizes scientific procedures of investigation. Within literary theory, you've got new criticism, new in terms of the 1930s, but that's just the name, the way it came about. It was called new criticism when it was new in the 1930s, but in new criticism, you analyze literary texts based upon principles of scientific analysis, the scientific method, in other words, in terms of literary investigation. Paradigmatic knowledge is very much associated with empiricism. Again, with paradigmatic knowledge, you get into compare, contrast in terms of what are the facts, what is the evidence, what does the data show, extended definitions in your writing, and analytic essays, thesis, claims, supporting evidence. I'll introduce you as we go along in extended detail to the Toulmin method of logical analysis, the Toulmin method of logical argumentation. I think that's important for you to know. The Toulmin model of logical argumentation is very much paradigmatic. And I think it is very important for you to know the Toulmin model of logical argumentation because in states across the nation, really all 50 states, the Toulmin model of logical argumentation is at the core of how state standards want you to be teaching persuasive writing to your students. So you really need to know the Toulmin model of logical argumentation. We get into narrative knowledge, and narrative knowledge is very much associated with rationalism, constructivism. You make sense of something through storytelling, metaphor, symbolism, parable. And finally, you have to keep in mind, do you have an etic approach or emic approach? Are you an outsider or are you an insider? Now, if you're an empiricist, that might not matter as much because knowledge is knowledge, right? There's one solid, stable form of knowledge, and we're looking for objectivity. But if you are a constructivist and a rationalist, then you realize that our interactions with cultures, with societies, our activities, our background knowledge are very much unique to ourselves. Knowledge is a unique individual construction. So whether you have the etic or emic approach, or whether you are an outsider or an insider, very much influences your understanding of knowledge. And the search for objective truth, when we talk about understanding how people learn, is thought of by constructivists as very problematic because of the very much constructed and ever-changing nature of knowledge and of reasoning. So anyway, that's just a brief introduction. It's not meant to be long, and I could go in so much more depth. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll talk about this more as we go along. Have a good night. Have a good day.